So with bodhicitta in mind, then we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Let's grab the text. Let's see. And so we're up to page 18 in Prabhupada text. Let's see. Yeah, so we'll go through these. This page, start this page. So this page begins, yeah. Yeah, we finished valid cognizers induced by another and induced by self. So anyway, now here, remember I said last time, whenever this text or whenever Buddhist texts say, texts in the law of the tradition say something is terminologically divided. Like, so if it says it's actually divided, that means that all the examples or all the categories listed are going to be actual categories. When it says terminologically divided, as it says here, that means they're not literally the thing. Does that make sense? So there was a saying that sometimes things in Buddhism, that's true, isn't it? Well, in life too, where things are called something, but they're not actually it. So it's like a terminological division. So here, this is a terminological division of valid cognizers, and so we'll go through those. So when valid cognizers are terminologically divided, there are three, right? So, and it says valid cognizers that are persons, valid cognizers that are speech, and valid cognizers that are consciousness. I'll just continue on. This is very brief. It says the first, a valid cognizer as a person, is, for example, the teacher, the Buddha. The second, a valid cognizer that is speech, is, for example, the wheel of doctrine of the Four Noble Truths. The third, a valid cognizer that is consciousness, is, for example, a direct perceiver or an inferential cognizer. So first of all, just to be clear, so category 3, those that are consciousness, are the only ones that are actual valid cognizers, pramana, right? So valid cognizers is the English term for pramana, right? So the actual experience of pramana is a consciousness, right? So it's going to be either, a valid cognizer that's a direct perceiver or a valid cognizer that's an inferential cognizer. But I'll just say briefly, like sometimes and for example, in Dharmakirti's texts and in Dignaga's texts, it often says the Buddha is pramana. Right? The Buddha is a valid or authoritative being or a valid being. And what that means is that all the Buddha's consciousnesses are pramana. Right? That the Buddha, actually all the Buddha's consciousnesses are direct valid cognizers, not even inferential. So there's a reason for using that term, the Buddha is pramana, right? In the sense that it's sort of explaining to us something of who the Buddha is and what the Buddha is like. But the Buddha is not literally, a person is not literally pramana, because pramana is a state of consciousness. And then the same thing when they say valid cognizers that are speech, for example, the Four Noble Truths. What that's getting at is that, on the one hand, speech is sound, right, or matter if it's written word. So it's not literally a consciousness, but let's see it right there. What they actually say is that the way one comes to know, for me, the way we come to know experientially that the Buddha is one gone to pramana is through his speech or her speech, if it's Tara, for example, or Vajrayogini or female lady. So so it's through the speech of an enlightened being that we come to appreciate the inner qualities of an enlightened being, and then we, by studying those doctrines, come to have pramana or valid cognition. Anyway, so the point being that the first, if you study pramana text, you'll see text, so that's why they say terminologically, you'll see in text where it says, the Buddha is pramana, or the the Four Noble Truths are pramana. And what that, and you have to remember that, their speech is not literally pramana, right? But it induces pramana and it reflects the pramana of the speaker. Yeah. So anyway, so that's why there are these terminological divisions. But then in the next section, F, clarifies this point, right? So it says, definitive enumeration of valid cognizers. With respect to the enumeration being definitive, valid cognizers is divided into two. Right. So now Purpachoke is pointing out what I just said, right? Which is that although those three things are sometimes called valid cognizers or pramana, it's only consciousnesses, right? And so here he lists, right, there are two types of valid cognition: direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers. And then he says that more than these are unnecessary and fewer would not be inclusive is the meaning of the enumeration of valid cognizers being limited to two, for valid cognizers are limited to those two. So those are the only two types of pramana or valid cognition. Anyway, so an inferential means, well, and she'll go into it here. Actually, I guess here he does it. Oh, yeah, he does. Listen to it on the next page. But then I'm just going to briefly, this next section is confusing, so I'll just I'll cover it briefly. And this, I'll preface. So what we just covered is standard, right? In other words, if you're going to study pramana at all, you need to know why they sometimes will refer to the Buddha as pramana, but he's not literally pramana, but his consciousness is pramana, right? And your consciousness can also be pramana, right? Valid cognition. But and then that there are two types: direct valid cognizers and inferential, as everybody needs to know. This next section here, these next two paragraphs, I think are kind of more about debate. Like in the monasteries, they always debating, like that's how the monks and that's how the nuns nowadays do, which is great. Study through debate. So this is a debate. These are some like points that I was looking at them and going, why are they making these points? I think it's about debate. So it says, with respect to the differences in substantial entity, direct perceiver and inferential cognizer are one substantial entity because a direct perceiver is one substantial entity with an inferential cognizer. Now, what are they saying there? Right, this is confusing, right? Because actually, ordinarily, if you have a direct perceiver, like if you see blue, that's not of one substantial entity with an inferential cognizer, right? Like, so in other words, if your eye consciousness sees blue, that's an eye consciousness seeing a color, right? Whereas an inferential cognizer, the example he's been giving, right? If he's, what is it? Sound is impermanent because it's a product, right? That's something realized by way of conceptual contemplation, right? So how are those of one substantial entity? And the truth is, they're usually not, right? So I was going, so why is he saying they are of one substantial entity? And this next two paragraphs are getting it. He's doing a debate. He's preparing people for debate. And what he's getting at is this: remember, this is the Sautantrika tenet system. And Sautantrikas believe in self-cognizers, right? And self-cognizers are of one substantial entity with the mind, with whatever main mind is occurring at that time. And a self-cognizer is a direct perceiver, right? All a self-cognizer does is directly perceive whatever is happening in consciousness at that moment. So if you're seeing the color blue, there's a self-cognizer that's aware you're seeing the color blue. So what he's saying here, when he says they're one substantial entity, is he means the self-cognizer that's directly perceived. So for example, if you have an inferential cognition, sound, you contemplate the meaning. Sound is impermanent because it's a product, and you inferentially realize that sound is impermanent. There is a self-cognizer that's aware of your realizing sound is impermanent. And so what he's saying here is those two, the direct perceiver that's a self-cognizer and the inferential cognizer, are of one substantial entity. And so he's playing, he's preparing, so you can imagine a debate courtyard, right? If you were to say, an inferential cognizer and a direct cognizer are one substantial entity, you could maybe win the debate because somebody would say, no, they're never of one substantial entity. One is conceptual and the other is non-conceptual. But then you could use self-cognizer to win the debate. You can, so I think he's doing that. And so he does this whole thing that he's being, I think kind of playful here, where he says, independence upon this reasoning, all of the following are established as one substantial entity. And so conceptual consciousness and non-conceptual consciousness. This is kind of funny. A mistaken consciousness and a non-mistaken consciousness, he's saying, are one substantial entity. In general, that would be ridiculous, right? Like, so, whereas if you said blue is orange, then that's a mistaken consciousness, right? If your consciousness were asserting that blue is orange. But he's saying the self-cognizer that's perceiving that, perceives accurately that you're perceiving blue as orange. So, so there's so he's playing for debate here, really, because in general, these statements are not true, but they are true. Those first two anyway. Then a sense consciousness and a mental consciousness. So how can those two be of one substantial entity? Ordinarily, a sense consciousness and a mental consciousness are different substantial entities. But when a sense consciousness, as I mentioned earlier, if a sense consciousness is seeing blue, the self-cognizer is mental, so they're of one substantial entity in that sense. For me personally, by the way, this is why it's hard to assert self-cognizers. Remember, prasangika madhyamikas don't assert self-cognizers. But this school does. So these statements would be true in the context of self-cognizers. That's what he's getting at here. This next one, though, mind and mental factors are one substantial entity. That's always true, actually. That's not just about self-cognizers. That's true in general. And we'll get into that in the next and later in this series of classes. Anyway, so I'm not going to go into more detail than that. Those points are really for debate, and they're sort of using self-cognizers in a debate. And I don't think most of us aren't really debating, so probably not going to be that much use of that. But that's what that is. If you read that, you'll go, what in the world is he talking about? How can a wrong consciousness and a a valid cognizer, will be of one substantial entity or something. So at least explain it so that you know what he's talking about. But I don't think you'll have a lot of use for that unless you find yourself debating with a monk or nun sometime. Then you can remember that and use it. You can say that if you come across a geshe, you can say, I think that these two are one substantial entity. They'll probably say, it depends what college they're from, what monastic college they're from. They'll have different arguments. But then turning to the top of the next page, he says, therefore, the definition of free of conceptuality is free from being a determinative knower that apprehends a sound generality and a meaning generality as suitable to be mixed. Remember, so right here, what he's getting at is that a direct perceiver is free from conceptuality. Right? So direct perceivers are free from being a determinative knower that apprehends a sound generality and a meaning generality as suitable to be mixed. I personally just want to say, I think this paragraph or this sentence, this little sentence is really important, because this is defining what is conceptuality in Buddhism. And actually, I'll just say, for me personally, I remember, they say Buddhas are free from conceptuality. Buddhas don't conceptualize. And there are all these things like that. I'll just share, I just want to encourage us, all of us, to ask questions. Because what I realize is that there are all these things, right? Conceptually, and you contemplate in meditation, and Buddhas are free from conceptuality, all these things about conceptuality. It took years before I realized I had never asked, what's the definition of conceptuality, right? And I thought I knew, there are so many things that you think oh, well, conceptuality, I've been doing that all my life, I conceptualize. But actually, what's the definition? What is conceptuality, right? That's what this is getting at. And so what is this saying? And actually, it's really, I think, subtle. Because first of all, so, this is saying that direct perceivers are free from this, but this sentence is also defining what is conceptuality then, right? So conceptuality is a determinative knower. Determinative means it knows something by way of elimination, right? It distinguishes it or determines it by illuminating what is not it, right? And then how does it do that? We're going to go into more detail later in the text, but it apprehends a sound generality, right, like a word or sound, and a meaning generality, which I could describe like as a mental image, as suitable to be mixed. Right? So in that sense, it uses some version of language, right, and some version of mental images, and sort of sees them as and also suitable to be mixed. Doesn't mean they're mixed yet, right? It could be there. It could be that they're already mixed, but that includes, for example, the reason why it says suitable to be mixed is, for example, if you hear a term but you don't yet know what it means, right? And so you're going, what is that? Well, now you have a sound generality, but you haven't yet mixed it with the meaning generality. You're looking for the meaning generality, right? And suitably mixed can also be the opposite. Sometimes you see or come up with a concept, and then you say, what is what's the word for that, right? Like you see some object and you say, what is that? Like, it might be right. If you see like some kind of new plant, right, you might say, what is that plant? Or if you like come up with, you see something in history, a historical event you hear about, you say, what was that? Oh, that was that war. That was that peace. That was that founding of a nation, whatever. Right. So you can have the mental image, or you can have the sound, the word, or you can have them both, and they're already mixed in your mind. And are you aware in your own experience that what Buddhism is saying is that's what conceptuality is, right? Is that you have these mental images, you have these words, and you see them as suitably mixed. And one implication, of course, of that, which we've talked about before, is that we ordinary people then also, confuse those sound generalities and meaning generalities for the things themselves, right? So if I think, of anyway, so you get my point, is that we also sometimes confuse that and think that our mental image and terms for a thing are the actual thing. And when we do that, for example, in relation to other people, that often causes problems, doesn't it? Because we think that the person is what our concepts of them are, but often our concepts are not entirely accurate, or they're limiting, or they're always limited. They're never complete, right? Because our concepts also are permanent phenomena, right? Permanent in the sense of not permanent like eternal, but static, right? Whereas people are always changing. People are impermanent moment to moment, and so on. But John, you had your hand up.
Yeah. I may be taking it too literally or just not understanding it, but when it says free from being a determinative knower, does that mean we should aspire to being a determinative knower so that we would understand that these things are not really what we think they are? Or, because at least when I read free from being something, it means you don't want to be that. But I thought our aspiration should be to be that. Or am I misunderstanding it?
Here it's getting at something I think maybe simpler in a way, which is that because on the one hand, if you see emptiness directly, for example, it would be realizing emptiness in a way that's not so in that sense, yeah, you would aspire to that. But here it's also getting an ordinary experience. So in other words, when you see the color red, right, with your eye consciousness, that's free from being a determinative knower because it's an eye consciousness. It's not a concept of red, right? It's your eye consciousness seeing red. Or if your ear hears a loud sound, that's not a determinative knower because it's the ear consciousness directly perceiving sound. So what this is also getting at a much more basic level, in the sense that everyday experience, if you feel water when you're in the shower, that's not a determinative knower. If you think water, that's a determinative knower that apprehends a sound generality and a meaning generality is really mixed. But if you're in the shower and you feel water on your face, that's not. So this is getting at something more basic than that. So you're not really aspiring, and that you don't have to be aspiring to it or not aspiring to it. It's just getting at that's more like the definition, even in ordinary everyday life. Again, sometimes you would aspire to that in the spiritual context of trying to realize emptiness directly, for example. But this also just gets at very ordinary experience, like like I just said, seeing the color red, or taking a shower, or eating, eating lunch, you have a flavor, and that flavor on your tongue consciousness is free from conceptuality. But if you think about, oh, I really love whatever, what I'm gonna have for lunch, that would be a conceptual knower, right? Where you have a sound, like if you think, oh, I like a sandwich, and I'm thinking of a sandwich, and some sound and an image is there, that's conceptual. But when your actual tongue consciousness is tasting it, it's not. It's free from conceptuality. So this is getting at something more basic than that, that pervades all of our ordinary everyday experiences, actually. And so it's really getting at also just so that, for now, I mean, we're going to get into in a second, there is a sense in which we aspire sometimes, but up to this point, I think it's more useful almost to view it as like a tool for looking at your own experience, right? Like, when am I conceptualizing? When am I knowing in a conceptual way, and when am I knowing in a non-conceptual way? And we want to do both, actually. As ordinary people, we need to have direct perceptions. So like, if we didn't have any direct perception, if you didn't have direct perceptions, you couldn't walk across a room, for example. But we also need conceptual, right? Like, we also need conceptual consciousnesses in our everyday life, because we're not enlightened, and we have to sometimes figure out, in a determinative way, that if you want to have lunch, where is your, where the food's in the kitchen, right? That's conceptual, knowing that. So both are important, actually, for just ordinary life. Other questions before I'm going to introduce now an idea that's in this next section. So next, what he says is non-valid consciousness. So non-pramana, right? Non-valid consciousness. And I'm just going to read the definition and the divisions, and I'm going to pause and sort of share some reflections. So he gives the definition. The definition is, in our own system, the definition of a non-valid consciousness is a knower that is not newly incontrovertible. Because the definition of pramana, right, a valid cognizer, is a new incontrovertible knower. So any knower that's not newly incontrovertible is non-valid. In this context, remember, non-valid conscious doesn't mean wrong necessarily, right? Because a subsequent cognizer can be incontrovertible, actually, but not new, right? If you realize something and then you continue to think about it, that's no longer a new, but it still can be incontrovertible. So non-valid conscious means, that it's not newly incontrovertible, but some, that can include, as we're about to see, wrong consciousnesses, but also correct consciousnesses can be included in non-valid. But and then he lists 5 here. And I'm just going to read the list. Subsequent cognizers, correctly assuming consciousnesses, are awarenesses to which an object appears but is not ascertained, doubting consciousness, and wrong consciousness. And now I want to pause and reflect together and sort of introduce this idea, because say something like, there are a number of things that have been useful, I think, in my view, in Purberjoke's text for a practitioner. But I think that this section, and really it's getting at, with the previous page plus this page, what's being presented actually are what are called, there is a famous category, the 7 ways of knowing. And so I actually want to list all 7. So the 7 would be these 5 plus the 2 mentioned on the previous page. So it would be direct valid cognizers, inferential valid cognizers, subsequent cognizers, correctly assuming consciousnesses, awarenesses to which objects appear but are not ascertained, doubting consciousnesses, and wrong consciousnesses. So sometimes there's a list of 7 ways of knowing, and that's those 7. And I just want to kind of go off on a small, well, it's not really a tangent because it's about that, but a small, like, something that's not covered in the text here. Because you may kind of wonder, well, why do we need to know that? And I want to present some thoughts. And actually say, like, when I first studied the 7 ways, these 7 ways of knowing, I thought, oh wow, that's really useful as like a guide for where are you at in your practice, And then later, I don't think he was there, but when Gyume Khenchen Rinpoche was teaching on, I think it was Mahamudra, he taught the 7 ways of knowing, because he was like, you can understand in your practice of Mahamudra, you need to know which of those 7 are you at. I was like, oh, that's awesome. That this pramana, this topic, the 7 ways of knowing, applies to all kinds of things in your actual practice of Dharma. And it also describes how to work on yourself, like how to actually make progress in your spiritual practice. So what I want to say is a couple of, like, I want to share just a few reflections. One is, one thing that's that can be difficult sometimes, I think, for our spiritual practice is, you practice Buddhism, right? And I sometimes laugh about this in a way, like, is that like, let's say thirdly, if you do, like, say, if you're trying to get like a degree or a career or whatever in our culture, well, there are clear steps in progress, right? Like like in college, right? You're a freshman. Then if you pass your classes, you become a sophomore. If you pass those, you become junior, and so on, right? Then you get a degree, and then, like, if you're at a job, you can, I don't know, there's even, like, what do they call them? You can have like the small raise, the medium raise, or a bigger raise, whatever. I don't know, but there's all kinds of things where it's like clear. And sometimes I have a good friend. We sometimes joke about this, like, with Buddhism, how do you tell, right? You can practice for years and you say, well, have I made progress? And one way the Dalai Lama points out is, am I more patient or less patient? Well, that's good. But then again, some days it's not linear, is it? Like, you can be more patient for quite a while, and then one day something happens and you find yourself very impatient, and you say, well, so am I making progress or not? And what I want to suggest is a couple of benefits to these 7 ways of knowing. One is, if you get to know what these are, you can check for, now that you have a tool to check for yourself. How am I doing in my spiritual practice? Because these 7 ways of knowing are clear, actually. It's clearly defined. And if you apply them to yourself in relation to topics of Buddhist practice, you can know where you're at. So it's like a self-assessment tool is one point. And then another point I would make is, it actually shows us how to progress, like, and how to identify in our own experience, where am I off track and how do I make progress spiritually? And so what I want to, and this is, Purva doesn't do this, but I'm going to go, this is my little, like, I'm not calling it a tangent exactly, but a commentary or sharing some thoughts, is on, I guess I want to say, on topics of spiritual significance for your own life. Right? One way of viewing, like, practice is that you want to actually look for your own wrong consciousnesses to start with. Right? Where do I have a wrong consciousness? And this is describing how you progress from a wrong consciousness to a better way of knowing, right? And so actually the other day, I was thinking about this, and, like, I came up, there are countless examples. But one example of the most famous example of a wrong consciousness in Buddhism is the mind grasping at in this tenet system, it would be a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? That's a wrong consciousness. And actually, have you even, and then you move, right, from wrong consciousness. A wrong consciousness totally believes in that, right? I have a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And if you insult myself, I may insult yourself right back, right? That's because I believe in my substantially existent, self-sufficient self, and I believe in it so strongly that I'll defend it, right? Then doubt, right? Doubt is progress in that sense, right? From wrong consciousness, if you start to go, well, I don't know, like, I read this Buddhist thing, and maybe there's not a self-sufficient substantially self. I'm not really sure, like, I think there is, but I'm not 100% sure, right? You start to doubt it. And part of the point they're getting at is, doubt is the first step towards overcoming wrong consciousnesses. Any wrong consciousness, right? I'm giving the example of self-sufficient, substantially self, but any wrong consciousness I have to, the first step is to start to doubt it, to go, maybe it's not true. And it mentions here, there in the text, we'll get to it, but there are 3 types of doubt. There's doubt leading in the wrong direction. There's equal doubt, where you say, I really don't know. And there's doubt leaning in the right direction. Remember, famously, I think Socrates was a great proponent of doubt, knowing what, is knowing you don't know, in that sense. But anyway, and so what I want to point out is, contemplative meditation is actually bringing up your wrong consciousnesses, right, or your doubts. And one way of working with them, and not all, but much of not all of contemplative meditation, but much of contemplative meditation is actually starting to recognize, maybe I'm wrong about this. And then developing doubt, eventually getting to doubt, leading in the correct direction. And eventually you come to a correctly assuming consciousness, where you believe something that's concordant with how things are, but you haven't yet realized it. Right? And then from there, oftentimes we come to an inferential cognition, right? Inferential valid cognizer. So there's a way of progressing through these states, through especially wrong consciousness, doubt, correctly assuming consciousness, and then inferential valid cognizers and direct valid cognizers. There's a sense of progressing through those. And with regards to selflessness or emptiness, what you want, then you go from inferential valid cognizer to direct valid cognizer, right? That's on the path of seeing, you gain the direct valid cognition of emptiness in the prasangika view. And so, actually, I want to give a more mundane example for a second. Because I just want to point something out. I want to encourage, like, I'm not going to check this, but I want to encourage like homework or something, which is to come up with examples of your own wrong consciousnesses, right? Where like, and I'm going to give it, I can't, I just the other day, I was like, oh, I have lots of them, but I was realizing like, one that came up to me, I remembered, and they're often they could be things from your culture, they could be things just from your personal life, they could be things from your childhood, whatever, but we have views, right? And like, I was thinking of I was actually thinking about this. I remembered I was thinking about myself, and I was thinking of when I was a little boy, both my father and my grandfather telling me it was important to stand up for yourself. And if somebody picked on you, you should punch them in the face, basically. Not punch them somewhere, not in the face necessarily. That you should stand up for yourself and fight. If somebody was picking on you, you fight them. And I thought, well, that's the exact opposite of what the Buddha would, of what the Buddha would say. They would say, practice nonviolence, And then I thought, oh wow, there's like, I don't get in fights, and I never have physical violence with it, but I realized there's a part of me that still believes that, that like under stress, like there's a part of me that I still believe that, although I don't act on it, right? So that's a wrong consciousness. And my point is that I'm just picking a simple example, right? That part of Buddhist practice is recognizing those parts of ourselves and saying, why do I believe that? Well, I believe it because I was, I looked up to my father, my grandfather when I was a little kid, and they told me that. And I saw them as strong and as wonderful, and they loved me. And so I still have a part of me that believes that. But is it true? Or is that a valid cognition, right? And you start to ask, and you ask yourself, well, why would that be true, and why would it not be true? And then you eventually, and hopefully you start to doubt it, right? And my point is like, that I guess what I'm trying to get at is this, is like, I'm going to go to a correctly assuming consciousness for a second. Correctly assuming consciousness are not incontrovertible, right? So I'm just giving in this example I was just giving, right? I have come to a correctly assuming consciousness. In other words, I believe that nonviolence is better than violence, right? But if I was looking, I go, I haven't really realized that, because realizing it would be it's incontrovertible, right? And that means that under extreme stress, that feeling wouldn't come up, that belief wouldn't come up, that old pattern wouldn't come up, right? So I have a correctly assuming consciousness with regards to nonviolence, but not an inferential valid cognizer, right? It's not incontrovertible, and so under stress, I can fall backwards into another feeling or another idea, a wrong consciousness. And part of what this is getting at is like, well, if you want to make progress spiritually, you work on that, right? Whereas you work on it until you have an inferential valid cognizer of the topic. And that's a much more powerful knowing that then has more effect on your behavior and on your feelings and on your relationships. And so what I'm getting at here is do you see how these, so we're going to study what are these, what are their definitions, but I was thinking I wanted to give this introduction because otherwise you could just feel like, well, why am I studying the definition of a subsequent cognizer? Why am I studying the definition of a doubting consciousness? But the reason we're studying that, one is for introspection, or is to recognize when are you having doubt, when are you having, correctly assuming consciousness and so on. But it's much deeper than that, right? So like, and I'll just share that. I remember when Gyumen Khenchri was teaching on Mahamudra, he was saying like, you need to have an inferential valid cognizer of emptiness, right? But he was also getting it. So like, actually, so I'll ask that, like in relation to, so one, my suggestion of a homework is come up with a mundane example. A mundane example of a wrong consciousness, not about emptiness, right? But come up with one that you actually, like that in everyday life, you like, and even if you don't admit it to other people, admit it to yourself, right? Like, it's like, admit to yourself, where is an example where I have a wrong consciousness? Right? You don't have to tell anybody else. I'm not going to ask in class, embarrass anybody here. But, we all have them. That's my point. If you're not a Buddha, right? If you're not a Arya Bodhisattva, we have wrong consciousnesses. So that's one point. But the other is with mundane. So look for a mundane example and start to contemplate. How can I doubt that? Why would I doubt that? Right? What's the valid, are there valid reasons, right? Because the idea is that to come to an inferential cognition, right, as I mentioned last time, you would have to realize, actually, so yeah, like for me to come to it, I was give my example, right, about nonviolence, right? I would have to realize the property of the subject, the pervasion and the counter-pervasion, which would mean I'd have to somehow realize, right, that in all instances, nonviolence is best, right? Right? It's not like it can't just be, well, usually, right? Because that's not an inferential cognition. That's like a practical idea, maybe, that's some kind of idea that it's usually. But the pervasion would mean there would have to be some recognition, right? And it's like, the Buddha said, right? Like, and actually the Buddha presented a reason, right? He said, the Buddha presents reasons why, right? Anger, about the faults of anger, right? That anger always causes suffering to oneself and others, right? That the karmic results of anger are always negative, that the results in the world of anger are always negative, that love is always better than anger. And I guess if I'm honest with myself, when I look at it, I think, well, yeah, love is definitely usually. That's what, like, if I look at myself honestly, I think love is definitely usually better than anger. But then I think, wait a second, I didn't say always. And I haven't realized, so I'm giving an example, right? If you're realizing the pervasion, you have to use the Buddha's reasoning. I would have to use that and say, can I accept that in every instance, love is better than anger? Right? Otherwise, I haven't realized it, right? Anyway, so one point I was making is look for some common everyday examples, mundane examples. Another point, though, that Gyumen Khenchri was making, which other lamas make also, is you can use. It's good to use this same framework framework of about cognition. I'll give you an example now about emptiness, right? So I'll ask you to contemplate just for a moment. I'm not going to ask anybody; nobody has to share this, but to contemplate. Well, where is my understanding? Like, are things? I'm going to use the Madhyamaka language, not the Sautantrika for a moment. So if I say, all things are completely empty of intrinsic existence because they're dependently arisen, right? That's a reason. My question to contemplate just for a moment is to ask yourself, well, where am I at in this framework? Do I have a wrong view, or I immediately say that's totally wrong? Or do I have doubt? Like, in other words, do I have a correctly assuming consciousness? And one point, that the lamas make is when somebody comes to an inferential valid cognition of emptiness, what do they say? It's like being struck by lightning. That's the way they say it. It's like a humongous transformative experience. It's like being bowled over. And Gyumen Khenchri said, after that, although it's not as powerful as directly realizing emptiness. He says, you're never, in that whole life, you're never the same again. Your reactions to things are totally radically transformed by the inferential cognition. So have I had an inferential valid cognition of emptiness? Or where am I at in my understanding of emptiness? And part of the reason I'm asking that is that's a very important question for our progress, right? In other words, if you can come from wrong view to say, and actually one point I'll make is like on emptiness, there's a famous quote from Arya Deva, the disciple of Nagarjuna, where he says, he's talking about emptiness in his 400 stanzas in the middle way. And he says, Arya Deva says, just having a doubt about this matter tears samsara to shreds. And when lamas comment on that, they say, he's getting at this. He's actually saying, if you come to, actually, they give a very detailed commentary. They say, of the three kinds of doubt, right? There's doubt leading in the wrong direction, equal doubt, and doubt leading in the right direction. And what they say is, because if you come to the level of doubt about emptiness leading in the correct direction, that's what tears samsara to shreds. That's a turning point. That's not yet, it's quite far still from inferential cognition, but you start to develop a kind of, I think emptiness is probably true, And what they say is that tears samsara to shreds, because that will lead you to eventually gain a correctly assuming consciousness about emptiness, and then that will eventually, if you continue thinking about it, lead to an inferential valid cognition. And then someday from that, you'll gain a direct cognition of emptiness, and you'll literally destroy samsara. So Arya Deva is saying, if you can get to doubt leading in the correct direction, that tears samsara to shreds, right? That's actually a big spiritual goal, just to reach the level of doubt leading in the correct direction about it. This would be like a big spiritual achievement, nowhere near what the lamas are describing when you gain an inferential cognition. It's like being struck by lightning, your whole life changed. But it's still quite significant, right? Arya Deva says so, and he knows because he reached that experience and then continued on. He eventually gained the cognition of things. But so this is the process. That's all I'm pointing out, right? Like whether it's about impermanence, right? Where am I at about impermanence? Especially momentary impermanence. Change instant by instant. Am I at doubt? Am I at correctly assuming consciousness? Have I realized that inferentially? And all I'm suggesting is, do you see now the use of the 7 ways of knowing? I hope you got some feeling for that. That these are like, and again, it's like, I think in a way, it's like, without these, it's almost like you're going somewhere and you don't have a map or something. You don't know how close you are. Like something, I don't know, like when you're going somewhere and you have a map, or you have Google Maps, or then you can have some sense of how close are you. Okay, well, I'm a quarter of the way there. Oh, now we're halfway, right? At least you have some way of orienting yourself. I find these as spiritually, in terms of our spiritual practice, they're a way of orienting yourself in terms of where am I at now. And you can know these are things that are not a mystery. They're not a mystery like, oh, it's unknowable. No, I have doubt, right? If you're honest with yourself, you can know that. No, now I have a correctly assuming conscience, but it's not incontrovertible. I need to get an incontrovertible. What am I missing? Am I missing? Do I not yet know the pervasion? Do I not know that, what am I missing to gain an inferential cognition? And you can work on it, how to work on it, if that makes sense. What do I need to contemplate on next in order to progress in this way, right? And you can pick any given issue and then use, I guess I want to say too, like in terms of moving from wrong consciousness to doubt and so on, if it's a mundane issue, then you can do research, right? You can if it's a spiritual issue, then you can do research in the Buddha's teaching, so it depends. Like if your wrong consciousness is about a spiritually significant thing, then if we're Buddhist, we use the Buddha's lines of reasoning and Nagarjuna's and Shantidevas and so on. But even the same thing applies, right? If I have a wrong consciousness about about some other topic, then we can do that, actually, because this is then we can do research on that topic, right? Learn about it. And then we can gain better and better, right? Like, I was recently having that, I'll just share, like, again, I mean, this wasn't spiritual, but like, about some medical decisions, right? I was like, oh, I don't know, like what, you have to make decisions and you don't know, like, it was like, I don't know this, right? So how do I gain at least a level, I may not be able to come to an inferential valid cognition, but how do I come to at least a correctly assuming consciousness, right? Where like, so if I think, oh, okay, like, so you may turn to authorities, we can share the research. Oh, there's, this has this common of side effect and this has this benefit. And if you do enough research, at least you can go from totally not knowing to having some greater clarity, for example, a correctly assumed consciousness. My point is like whether it's a mundane issue or a spiritual issue, it's through contemplation and learning, right, that we can progress through these stages. So that's that. So now we can look at the definitions of these things, and they'll be useful because they're helping us. You see how they're helping us, right? By looking at the definitions, then you know how to and what they are. Then you learn to recognize it in yourself, and how do you move through these. So, so the first, and now Prabhupada goes in his order through these. So subsequent cognizer. So with respect to the first, the definition of a subsequent cognizer is a knower that realizes what has already been realized. Right. So, and again, realized here. I just want to remind you because I think John asked the question earlier, and so this can be about something very mundane, or it can be something about something incredibly profound, right? Because like a knower that realizes what has already been realized. Like if I, with my eye consciousness, if I stare at my table's red. So if I stare at red, the first, if I'm staring at it after, after the first moment, it's a subsequent cognizer of red, right? That's a very mundane thing, but I'm realizing that's red, and I'm realizing what's already been realized. So if I stare at the red, that's a subsequent cognizer, right? But but a subsequent cognizer can also be if you've realized emptiness, and then you're dwelling in meditation on emptiness. That would be the second moment of that would be a subsequent cognizer, right? You've realized emptiness, and now you're knowing what a knower that realizes what has already been realized. You're realizing the truth of emptiness after having initially realized it, right? That would be a subsequent cognizer. Same with impermanence and so on. So subsequent cognizers could be about incredibly profound spiritual topics, or they can be about, very mundane topics. Like it's either way, but it's just that it's realizing something that's been realized before. Then it says when subsequent cognizers are divided, there are three: directly perceiving subsequent cognizers, conceptual subsequent cognizers, and subsequent cognizers that are neither of the two. And actually, he goes on. He describes them more, so I'll keep going, and it'll become clear, I think. So directly perceiving subsequent. So he's elaborating on the first, those direct perceiving subsequent cognizers. So with respect to those, there are five subtypes. Directly perceiving subsequent cognizers that are sense direct perceivers, directly perceiving subsequent cognizers that are mental direct perceivers, directly perceiving subsequent cognizers that are self-knowing direct perceivers, directly perceiving subsequent cognizers that are yogic direct perceivers, and directly perceiving subsequent cognizers that are none of the four. And then he gives examples. So the first, right, which would be a sense direct perceiver, would be a sense direct perceiver, the second moment of a sense direct perceiver apprehending blue. So that was like my example. If I'm staring at the table, right, in my case, it's a red table, but the first moment of seeing it would be if I'm seeing it with an eye conscious, the first moment would be a direct valid cognizer. Then there will be subsequent cognizers, right? In his case, blue. Or if you're feeling, if I'm feeling the pressure of these glasses on my hand, right? Like the first moment would be a tactile sense valid cognizer, right? Direct valid cognizer. But now I'm continuing to focus on the feeling of the glasses on my hand. That's subsequent valid cognizer, right? That's sensory. So the first type is sensory, right? The second type, which are mental direct perceivers, he gives the example of a mental, right? This is the second moment of clairvoyance, knowing another's mind, right? So somebody who has calm abiding, who has clairvoyance, and the first moment would be a mental direct valid cognizer, and the second moment of their clairvoyance would be a mental subsequent cognizer. The third is, for example, the second moment of a self-knowing direct perceiver experiencing an eye conscious. So that's just self-knowers. We already talked about that. Then for the next one would be the yogic direct perceivers, right? So the yogic, he gives the example. An example of a subsequent cognizer that's a yogic direct perceiver would be the second moment of the uninterrupted path of seeing, right? So just to be clear, right? On the path of seeing, in the first moment, one realizes in this tenet system selflessness, right? Directly. Actually, yeah, you could say that. So, or anyway, one realizes selflessness. So the second moment of that realization would be a subsequent cognizer. In the Prasangika system, the first moment would be a direct perceiver realizing emptiness. Right? But then the second moment of that, and so on. Well, the person, there are actually said to be 16 moments on the path of contemplation, on the path of seeing. So, all the ones after the first moment would be subsequent cognizers. In that case, realizing emptiness. And then the fifth, right? He says the fifth is, for example, the second moment of a direct perceiver. What's he getting at there? What he's getting at, and it ties back to the subsequent cognizers that are neither of the two, is what he's saying is it's the general category. I guess I'll just say it this way. It's the general category. So in other words, if you say a direct perceiver, that's the second moment, that would be a subsequent cognizer. So he's just leaving something for the general category for discussion, but there isn't an example. There is any specific example of that would be one of the above four. But he's saying that one's just a general category that's more like for discussion. But the specific examples of those would be mental, sensory, yogic, and so on. Okay, so those are the types of direct perceivers that are subsequent cognizers. And then there are also conceptual. Remember that those are direct perceivers. And there are also conceptual subsequent cognizers. And these can be divided into two types: conceptual subsequent cognizers that are induced by direct perceivers, and conceptual subsequent cognizers that are induced by inferential cognizers. The first is, for example, a factually concordant consciousness, ascertaining blue that is induced by a sense direct perceiver apprehending blue. So what this is saying is, and then the second is second moment of inferential cognizer running sound to be impermanent. So what this is saying is there are also conceptual subsequent cognizers, right? And what he's saying is that there are two types of these, and they're all factually concordant. So the first of them would be that the conceptual consciousness, that's the subsequent cognizer, is induced by a direct perception. In the second kind, it's induced by a process of inferential knowing. And so what's he getting at there? Just to be clear, like, and let's be, I'm going to give a simple example here. If I look at Larry's image on this call, right? I have a visual consciousness perceiving Larry, and then I think, oh, that's Larry, right? So that's conceptual, right? When I think that's Larry, that's a factually concordant, as he puts it, a factually concordant conceptual knower, right? It's accurate. And it's induced by a direct perception, right? So it's a subsequent, and if I continue to think, oh, that's Larry, yeah, there he is, right? That's a subsequent cognizer. That's factually concordant and is ascertaining Larry. It's conceptual, it's a subsequent cognizer, and it was induced by a direct perception. So that's one type of conceptual subsequent cognizer. Then there's a very different kind, right? That's a subsequent cognizer, and that would be where it's a cognizer that's induced through reasoning, right? And that would be like, he gives the example of sound being permanent, but to give a more simple example, like or more everyday example, if if I heard fire engines and looked out, opened my window and looked out and smelled smoke and saw billowing smoke coming from a house down the road, but didn't see the fire directly, I could induce there's a fire, right? There's billowing smoke, I could smell fire, I could smell smoke, and I could logically determine, oh, there's got to be a fire. That's why the fire engine is going, right? That would be inference, right? I didn't see it directly, but through a process of inference, I didn't see fire, but I can induce through logic that there's fire, right? And then if I'm after the second moment of that knowing that there's fire, that would be a subsequent cognizer that is induced by inference. Right? So that's a more mundane example. A more spiritually significant example would be if a person were to realize selflessness, right, and then they were to bring that realization back to mind and contemplate on it or dwell in that awareness. That would also be a subsequent cognizer, right? Knowing what's already been known, but in that case, it's through inference. So anyway, you get my point. Those are different types of subsequent cognizers. And I just want to pause there. Why are subsequent cognizers significant? Right? They're often what we have, aren't they? Like most of the time, the first moment of knowing something is just the first moment, right? Most of the time, we're doing subsequent cognition of something we already realized when we're realizing something. And again, whether it's mundane, like the example of there being fire, or whether it's quite spiritually significant, like selflessness or impermanence. Next, he covers correctly assuming consciousness. So he says, with regard to the second of these non-pramana consciousnesses, correctly assuming consciousness, there are two parts, the definition and the divisions. The first is the definition. Correctly assuming consciousness is a factually concordant determinative knower, which is controvertible with regard to its determined object. So what does that mean? First of all, it's a determinative knower. That means it's conceptual, right? So these are conceptual consciousnesses, which, so it's a conceptual consciousness which knows something that is controvertible with regard to its determined object, right? So controvertible means it hasn't realized it. It's not definitive, right? It concords with the fact, but it doesn't know it in a definitive way or in an incontrovertible way, right? And one way of sometimes saying this is an example of this would be in spiritual life, in one's spiritual life, this could be blind faith, right? So it could be like, when one has kind of faith in something, one believes it, but one doesn't really know, right? There are many examples of this also, aren't there? Like, actually, I think this is quite interesting, isn't it? Like, if you think about this from a spiritual perspective, it'd be like blind faith, right? But also, actually, like, I guess I just want to point out how, like, there are a lot, I mean, actually, there are a great many things like that, aren't there? Where we sort of, and actually, kind of difficult question here. How do you determine whether you're having a correctly assuming consciousness or a wrong consciousness? Right? Because many people, many of us, when we're having wrong consciousnesses, may think we're having a correctly assuming consciousness, right? Because it's an interesting point. A correctly assuming consciousness is factually concordant, right? It concords with the fact. But I just want to ask you to think about that for a moment, right? Like, because nowadays, right, there are all these examples of anyway, we can see, like, you can see, I mean, it's easy, I mean, it's always throughout human history there have been examples of this, but right now it's a time where it's like quite obvious, right? That we all tend to assume we're right? So we tend to assume that our beliefs are factually concordant. Sometimes we think we're realizing something incontrovertibly even, but we're wrong. We have a wrong consciousness. So I just want to ask you, if it's controvertible, right? It's not a definitive knower. Then how do you know that you're having a correctly assumed consciousness versus a wrong consciousness? I just want to ask you to think about that. It's an interesting question, right? Because you can't know it. One point here is that in that moment, if you're honest with yourself, you can't know yet that it's factually concordant for certain, right? Can you? Because if you knew it for certain, it would no longer be a correctly assuming consciousness. It would be an inferential valid cognizer, right? But what this is pointing out is there are correctly assuming consciousnesses, right? And actually, I'm just reflecting on this. I'm feeling a little under the weather today because I got my shingles vaccine yesterday. So I've been feeling under the weather last night and today. But I was thinking about that in this example. I was like, well, I think I have a correctly assuming consciousness that it's a good idea to get a shingles vaccine. I asked my physician at my physical. I read the research on it. I read the CDC's recommendations, and my physician referred to the what's it called, the Food and Drug Administration's recommendations, and so I did a fair amount of research, but I don't have a inferential valid cognizer of the benefits of it. Like, no, whereas I just read the research, 90% effective in preventing episodes of shingles, but like, do I know that for certain? I didn't do the actual research study. I didn't read the original research study even. I read an article that was referring to the original research study. So this is an example, right, where I think I'm having a correctly assuming conscience that it was worth having side effects to get that particular vaccine. But I didn't have an inferential valid cognition. I'm assuming that it's a correctly assuming consciousness. I hope it was, because it was unpleasant, side effects. But I hope I was correct. But you see my point there, though. Like, in other words, that you have to like ask, where am I at in my knowing of this, right? And at what point would one have a inferential valid cognition of a topic, right? And also on which topics are possible. There are some topics that a given person can't yet have it, right? That's what we said, fully fledged, right? There are certain topics where I'm not a fully fledged, we're not fully fledged people, so we can't yet have an inferential or direct valid cognition of certain topics, right? And so I'm just suggesting these are things to contemplate in our own experience. And again, whether it's about a mundane example, like given that was one example of a medical thing, right? Or if it's a very spiritually significant, like let's assume if you have a correctly assuming conscience, which is quite a big achievement, that's more than doubt leading in the correct direction, about emptiness, right? And I guess what I want to suggest is, I just want to point something out, is actually, I think the only way you can definitively know that you had a correctly assuming consciousness is later, right? One way of knowing that is you can subsequently look back if you realize something directly or inferentially. You can say, oh, I had a correctly assuming consciousness at that point. Also, somebody else who's realized it can look at you and say, oh, this person now has a correctly assuming consciousness, right? Or if you're Buddhist, you can say, well, now I have a factually, if the Buddha is correct, I have a factually, in other words, I compare in relation to what the Buddha said, I now have a correctly assuming consciousness with regards to this. Can I yet prove definitively through inferential cognition that the Buddha was correct? If you have a correctly assuming consciousness, not yet, right? But you can, believe that you have a correctly assuming consciousness because you've now come to a factually concordant determinative knower that's controversial with regard to something the Buddha said. But you can't know it definitively for yourself until you realize it, right? Anyway, but it's quite a spiritually significant level with regards to, say, selflessness or impermanence or other topics like that. But it's not good enough. I just want to point that out, right? Buddhism says correctly assuming consciousnesses. I want to point something out also, like they're a great achievement, say, with regards to emptiness. They're a great achievement, and at the same time, they're not enough. They're not liberative, right? In and of themselves, they don't cause liberation, right? So what you determined to be true in a controvertible way is still, it doesn't have, I guess what I would say is, one way of putting it is, it doesn't have yet enough power to fully, to affect your lived life as much as one would want. But it's helpful. So then, and then this is interesting now for our process. Yeah, good time. This is really useful, I think, this next section about correctly assuming consciousness. When correctly assuming consciousnesses are divided, there are 5. Correctly assuming consciousnesses that do not have a reason. Correctly assuming consciousnesses that have a contradictory reason. Correctly assuming consciousness for which the reason is indefinite or lacks pervasion. Correctly assuming consciousnesses for which the reason is not established. And correctly assuming consciousness for which a reason exists but is not settled. And I just want to point out, like, I want to suggest something to everybody, which is this next section, this list is great to contemplate. So I want to say, like, I don't know, earmark it or put a note on it or something for yourself. Because again, for our spiritual process, this is very important, right? What this is saying is, like, if you have a correctly assuming consciousness, why is it correctly assuming and not a valid inferential cognition, right? And why is that important? Because for spiritually significant topics, we want to have an inferential cognition, right? So what's missing? What's going wrong? Why is it only a correctly assuming consciousness? So here we go. The first, a correctly assuming consciousness that does not have a reason is, for example, an awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent. It depends upon the mere words. Sound is impermanent. This is a suitable example because the word sound is impermanent express a thesis that sound is impermanent, but not a reason, right? So that one, you get the point there, right? Sometimes we have a correctly assuming consciousness, like, and actually, this is, and really, this first one, it really is like blind faith, right? Like, so in other words, if I attend a talk by the Dalai Lama or another spiritually important person, and they say something, right? And then I think, oh yeah, that's right, because like so and so said it, so it's just based on the words, right? On the words that they said, but there's no reasoning behind it for me, right? They may have had a reasoning to realize that, but I don't have any reasoning, right? And again, is that a good thing? According to Buddhism, yeah, that's good. It's factually concordant, right? But it's not transformative, right? Somebody else will come along and say, then if I go to like some other, there are certain Hindu schools that say sound is permanent, right? And if I go to a talk by some famous person with that, then I'll say, oh, that's great, sound is permanent, right? And there's not a reasoning, so it's controvertible and it's fickle, right? And using my example from earlier, right? Like if like the Dalai Lama says, he's dedicated his life to nonviolence, right? To nonviolent approach to life. And the truth about, I was realizing that recently, like, is when I'm with the Dalai Lama, I feel very strongly that nonviolence is good, or Khyentse Rinpoche, right? But is my knowing of that incontrovertible? That's always best, right? Have I come to a reason that my example from earlier? Is it always a bad idea? Is anger always a bad idea? Right? I'm just saying that's an example where, is it because it's just you've heard the words, or have you gained a reason? Right now we're going to keep going. There are other ways, there are other obstacles, but one is just the words. So through the power of somebody else's words, you can come to an experience of a correctly assuming consciousness, but that's not very, again, that's blind faith, or it's not very powerful. The second, a correctly assuming consciousness having a contradictory reason is, for example, an awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent from the sign of it being empty of being able to perform a function. This is suitable because empty of being able to perform a function is contradictory with impermanence. So whereas here, you have a correctly assuming consciousness based on a reason that's not a correct reason at all, right? And actually, I want to point something out, like, this happens all the time, doesn't it? And I was sometimes recently have you ever had I was having that experience in the last few years sometimes, where I would realize, like, I would hear somebody talking about something like in the sphere of politics, for example, and I would realize, oh, they're gonna, like, their reasoning is totally, I mean, I could see that it was totally wrong, right? But they were, but their conclusion, I think, was correct, in the sense, like, in other words, they were going to vote for the person who had the better policy than the, and it's kind of funny, isn't it? We all do that, though. That's my point. Like, we all sometimes have wrong reasoning that comes to a correct conclusion, and so our thinking is confused then, right? Yeah, anyway, and we can have that about spiritually significant topics or everyday mundane topics, right? Yeah, anyway, I'm just pausing to think, there are countless examples of this one, aren't there? About all different topics where people have a reasoning that doesn't apply, and in this case, right, sound is able to, the example he's giving here, sound is able to perform a function, right? So if the person thinks sound's not able to perform a function, therefore it's impermanent, it's actually, you could say it's a contradictory reason or a wrong reason. The reason doesn't apply to the topic. And we all do that at times, right? So that's, again, it's going to be, is that incontrovertible? Of course not, right? Whereas at some point you may realize that your reasoning is wrong, then you're going to lose your correctly assuming consciousness. Then the third, a correctly assuming consciousness for which the reason is not ascertained is, for example, an awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent from the sign of being an object of comprehension. This is suitable because the object of comprehension is a reason that is indefinite in the proof of that. Because whatever is an object of comprehension is not necessarily impermanent, right? Because there are some things that are objects of comprehension, like uncompounded space or emptiness. Those are existent objects of comprehension that are not impermanent. So it's a reason that doesn't, where there is no pervasion. Does that make sense? It's not, there's no pervasion. Not all instances of object of comprehension are impermanent. So it's a different kind of wrong reasoning, right? The first one was a wrong reasoning where there wasn't the property of the subject, right? It wasn't true. That wasn't a property of sound. Here, it's a wrong reason because there's no pervasion. Then the fourth, a correctly assuming consciousness for which the reason is not established is, for example, an awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent from the sign of being an object of apprehension by an eye consciousness. This is a suitable example because the object of comprehension by an eye consciousness is a reason that is not established in the proof of that. Right. So in that case, what they're getting at there is objects of comprehension of an eye consciousness are impermanent. Right. So that would be it would be a correct reason. In other words, anything you can see with your eyes is going to be impermanent, right? Because it's, that's the nature of visual objects. But sound is not seen by the eye, right? So it's another kind of incorrect reason. And then the fifth, a correctly assuming consciousness for which the reason exists but is not settled is, for example, an awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent from the sign of being a product without its having been ascertained by valid cognition that sound is a product and that whatever is a product must be impermanent. This is suitable because although product is a correct sign, the proof of sound as impermanent, that person is not settled. So there, right, this is where, and actually, do you see the point? I just want to point something out, which is, this is going through, like, you're getting closer in this example, in these types of correctly assuming consciousnesses. It's like you're getting closer and closer, and that's intentional here, right? It's somebody with a, so you're starting with one where just it's the words. There's no reasoning at all, right? Then you're starting to apply reasonings, but the reasonings are wrong or are faulty in some way. And the last one, you've come to the exact correct reasoning, but you just haven't realized the reason or the property of the subject or the pervasion. So you have the correct reason, but you haven't yet realized the parts of the reason. So therefore you can't yet have an inferential cognition, but you're getting closer and closer. And what I want to just point out about that is, again, this is our process, right? So even within correctly assuming consciousness, if you realize, let's say, if you recognize, I think I seem to have a correctly assuming consciousness in regards to emptiness, right? Well, what's missing? Are you applying a wrong reason? Or have you not yet realized, so if your reason is, let's say it's emptiness, and it's that all things are dependently arisen, right? Is it that you haven't realized that all things are dependently arisen? Or is it that you haven't realized that that which is dependently arisen must be empty, right? Which is it, right? Because you need to work on one of those two. We need to work on one of those two. That then we can go from a correctly assuming consciousness to an inferential valid cognition, right? What's kind of funny is if you have the wrong reasonings, that's harder, isn't it? You can sometimes realize, actually, it's easier, isn't it? I'm just thinking about it right now as I'm talking, but in one way, it's a little easier actually to realize, oh, I only believe this because of the words, right? Like, so you can say, well, why do I believe X? Well, because I read it in a book or something, right? Or somebody I respect said it. Okay, but that's not, that's not going to be inferential cognition. It's just going to be correctly assuming conscious at best, right? But then then what do you need to do? Start applying reasons, right? Start analyzing, start exploring it, start researching it, start thinking about it. And as you go further and further into that, we're going to do some of these things, right? This is not a problem. It's not something bad. So we're going to have contradictory reasons or reasons, reasons that are not ascertained and so on. We're going to do all those things. And that's if we're actively working on something, that's good. That's how we get to eventually the last of them, which is a correctly assuming consciousness using a correct reason, but where the reason is not settled for oneself. Right? And I just want to suggest to all of us, including me, like I sometimes say that, for me personally, this is how I think of it, is it's good because it's actually good to, like, sometimes say the part of yourself that doesn't believe it, or the part of yourself, like what's the part of you, regards to some topic in your spiritual practice, to bring up the part of you that says, I don't think so, like that. So, and with regards to what Nagarjuna says, or what the Buddha says, or what is, we have to like bring up those aspects of ourselves, and that's the real debate, if that makes sense, right? Like, and I've sometimes mentioned this before, like there's a beautiful book by the first Panchen Lama, Losing Chogi Gyaltsen, who wrote the Lama Chopa, Guru Puja, where he it's a beautiful book where he debates with himself, and so it's a debate. He calls it a debate between there's different translations of the terms here, but essentially it's a debate between the ignorance of self-grasping and the primordial wisdom of emptiness, primordial wisdom. And it's quite a funny book, actually, where like ignorance will say to wisdom, who cares about you? Like, look at the world. Nobody has any interest in wisdom. You're totally irrelevant. You're like a has-been. You're a nobody. Nobody wants wisdom. Like, what could be less relevant than you? And then wisdom says, not, essentially, like, not relevant. What are you talking about? Like, in the world, there is, I understand the nature of the world. You don't understand the nature of the world. You don't even know what the world is. So how would you know that I'm not relevant in the world? Well, you don't know, even you have a wrong idea of what the world is and how it exists and how you exist. That's ridiculous that I'm irrelevant. Like, you're irrelevant because what your view of the world is totally wrong. And then they go back and forth. What do you mean by I'm wrong? And then they have this like debate, where they eventually get to extremely subtle points about the nature of emptiness and the nature of reality. And my point is like, what this is getting at, this part here about correctly assuming consciousness, and is the Panchen Lama there is showing this is how you make progress, right? He wasn't just writing that to be funny or something. I mean, he was being sometimes humorous, but he wrote his text to show this is how you contemplate. This is how you explore the nature of reality. Is you debate with yourself, and those debates that the monks or nuns are doing in a debate courtyard. This is the ultimate purpose of that, if that makes sense, is to gain insight and to gain inferential valid cognition. And and so whether you're debating with a friend, you having a discussion with a friend in order to get to the insight, or you're thinking about it in your own inner contemplation, how this is the process, if that makes sense. So these categories of correctly assuming consciousness are incredibly useful in the sense of going, well, okay, apply them to our own process in regards to these spiritually significant topics. And let's see, one last thing, and then I'll take the question. But I wanted to mention that I remember, like, when Yume Kenshin used to teach in New York, we used to sit around and debate, like what he taught. Like after he would teach, a group of us would hang around and like debate on what he had taught on. And one thing that really struck me was, like, it really did strike me that a lot of my friends who had grown up in the US I noticed, like, myself and them wanted to be right. You wanted to get it right. And what I noticed was, like, it was particularly Tashi and Geshe Darge. I noticed the two of them, they over and over again took the wrong position on purpose, like, and wanted to be wrong. And I was like watching that, and I was going, oh wow, like, in other words, like, I had this recognition, like, we're debating, like, in order to sort of not embarrass ourselves or seem like something, and they're debating to try to induce an actual understanding, and so they would fiercely debate, arguing for a wrong view. And then if they were starting to win, I would see then they would like slow down and throw a lifeline to the other person, because they were trying to help the other person understand where we were wrong, or where they were wrong, or where whoever was wrong. And I was like, that's the process of debate, which we need to do with ourselves, if that makes sense, and with friends. Because, and like Geshe Darge said it, like, I remember watching one day when he was debating, and like somebody argued for something, and then he was going, oh, you just believe that because Khenpo Rinpoche just said it in the teaching. He was getting it correctly assuming consciousness. He said, you only think that because Khenpo Rinpoche said that. I don't agree with Khenpo Rinpoche. I think this is, I'm disagreeing with Khenpo Rinpoche. And then he would argue for why he was disagreeing. And I was watching, and like, my friend was losing the debate. There was like, so he was saying, no, Khenpo Rinpoche is right. This is why. And then Geshe Darge saying, no, Khenpo Rinpoche is wrong. Here's why. And then I was watching and my friend was losing the debate. And then, and he was trying, I guess you'd argue, was just trying to help my friend to see, like, you don't, there was like, it's not enough to say, well, he said it, or to have some flimsy reason that you can't show to yourself and therefore to somebody else is correct. Then you haven't realized it. So you need to think more. And he was encouraging the person to think more, which was very kind. That's my point. But Larry, sorry, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, this is actually turning out to be a lot of fun. I'm reminded of two things. First is that there's a video on YouTube of this monastery in Tibet, and I don't remember the name of it. I've got it marked somewhere, but they're having this debate, and it struck me how they went about doing it. You think of the monk sitting there and meditating and everything being quiet, and then bells and stuff. And all of a sudden, this group of monks are debating, and I don't know what they were saying because it was in Tibet, but they were really animated. And there would be a group sitting, and one would be standing here, another standing there, and then one would say something, and then he'd slap his hand, and it's like, gotcha. And then the other one would do the same thing. I would have given anything to know what they were saying. But it reminded me of all the philosophy classes I've ever had and classes I've taught on it, is that this, and I'm going to try to say this correctly, because the biggest difficulty in this for me is articulating what it means as we study this. Because what you said a while ago kind of began to resonate with me, is that there's not one particular, in philosophy, if we're doing a formal debate, we do a particular concept or theory, and we beat it to death until there's nothing left, and then we say, okay, we're done. Whereas in this, you're going through different ways of looking at something, and you mentioned perceiving it with the eye, or seeing it with the eye, hearing it with the ear, but it's impermanent. But it's also, depending on what we do or don't know about the mind, that it's still there in some form that we can continue with in the different concepts you were talking about. And to me, I'm thinking of the entire meditation process where all of this that I'm taking in, learning all of these concepts that we're going through, and also going to jump ahead to the end of the book and read what that says now. But it's a process that we're going to follow through individually. I guess we could have that conversation, with a group or a couple of people, but ultimately I think, and I'm using the word enlightenment is where we're headed to, that if we're doing all this individually and we're trying to learn this process, I don't know if that's the correct word, but learn all these different ideas and how to practice those ourselves, the better we get at that, the more we do that, the closer it brings us to enlightenment. And I'm going to stop there before I really screw it up. But I mean, it really did resonate at that point where you're talking about the eye and the ear, and because it occurred to me, if it's impermanent, well, it's gone. But it's not really gone. We saw it, we heard it, and especially when you mentioned the politicians, because I could have a lot of fun talking about that. They say something, it's impermanent. Yeah, they got that right. And other things along that. But it is something that we have to, I think, individually determine how we process that information and what we do with it. And it's not simple. I mean, I think it's, as you're going through these steps, today is when we hit that point where I thought, wait, this is not just one thing we learned and do that, and we learn that thing and do that. It's all of this together that will come to a point where that we, the individual, can meditate and do it. And I'll stop with that.
That's great.
I didn't actually have a question there. I was just telling you what I thought.
I think it was great, though. It was great sharing. It was more of sharing, but I think it was great sharing. Really interesting. Yeah, just thank you. That's very interesting. Anybody else want to share anything, or either ask something or share? We should pause there, I guess. Oh. Frank, do you want to say something too? Or
oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so in the relation to what we've been learning today, I'm thinking in terms of a simple meditative practice where, for example, on emptiness, and I'm looking at, is this self, this I, is it the same as the mind-body complex, or is it different than the mind-body complex? And then you're going through all the various reasonings, and then coming to some inkling of what emptiness is. Clearly not an inferential cognition completely, but what type of cognition is that I'm coming to? And then is it the subsequent cognizer of that inkling that I'm trying to do abiding meditation in afterwards? That's my question. Yeah.
Really interesting question. Yeah, like, sometimes I think, isn't it like, on a practical level, like, if you think of like, and this is where put in a couple of things. One is like, Dalai Lama often points out, like, there's a traditional Tibetan, he quotes this traditional Tibetan saying that, like, the Pramana teachings and the Madhyamaka teachings in Tibet from the time of Shantarakshita on, it was like two lions yoked together, like very fierce, in other words, you can't attack from either direction. And it's like, I think one thing you're getting at is that one uses these concepts, for example, in relation to understanding Madhyamaka, and one comes to a kind of a more and more, clear understanding is one point. But then if you apply these particular teachings, right, like, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because, like, whenever somebody meditates on emptiness, right, you sort of, in one way, we pretend to ourselves that we're having an inferential cognition, even when we're not, is one point, isn't it? And if you think about it from a practical perspective, right, you say, oh yeah, this is emptiness, and now you dwell in it, right? And at the beginning, actually, one might, like, actually it's varied, isn't it? Like, I'll just give an example. Like, so, like, in one moment, I can remember, I'll give an example. Like, right, you might have like, say we're a beginner and we don't have a good understanding of emptiness yet, right? So, like, in general, one's level might be like doubt leading in the wrong direction, right? But still, when you think about emptiness, you dwell in that understanding, right? You go, okay, like it says in the text, even sometimes, whatever level you have, right, now dwell. And sometimes when lamas are giving initiation, they'll say, dwell in whatever recognition of emptiness you have, right? And so, at a given point, the person's actual understanding might be doubt leading in the wrong direction. It shouldn't be wrong. If it's a totally wrong consciousness, then that won't work. But even if it's doubt leading in the wrong direction, and also one other point I want to make is sometimes also one can go back and forth a little bit in the sense of, in general, let's say a person's usually a doubt leading in the wrong direction. But I'm going to give an example. Let's say then they go to an empowerment and they're with, a great lama, and the lama says, because the self is not one with the aggregates and is not other than the aggregates, therefore it lacks any intrinsic nature. In a moment, the person might have a correctly assuming consciousness based on mere words, right? Like, oh, this great lama said that, and they're very powerful, and actually it happens, doesn't it? Some of the lamas are quite, their presence is quite powerful, and their realizations kind of create a kind of a certain environment around them. And so one might actually, for a moment, have a correctly assuming consciousness based on mere words, and one dwells in that. Good. That's still better than, it's a good thing, actually, right? But then as soon as the lama leaves, they're back to doubt leading in the wrong direction, let's say, because it was really through the power of somebody else's words and presence that they were having some experience. And so I guess one point I would make is that we can go back and forth a little bit, depending on who we're around or what our outer circumstances are. Not until we get to incontrovertible, right? If it's controvertible, it means we can go backwards still. And I think if you actually check your own experience, sometimes this happens, doesn't it? Where, like, say you have, like, the Dalai Lama suggests this, and everybody suggests it, actually, where you could have, like, take a verse from the Guardian and apply it, right? And so I think one way of viewing that is that, like, there comes up to a certain level, I think it's like we may be in a state of doubt, but then use the words of somebody else, even on our own meditation, to come to a correctly assuming consciousness based on mere words, or sometimes it could be based on reasons that we haven't realized, for example. but you induce whatever ascertainment you can, and you dwell in it. And by continually doing that, that's how we actually progress, isn't it? Like, so if you take that kind of reasoning and you keep applying it, it's quite interesting, I think, that, like, to be honest, like, I've often thought of that. Like I remember one day it was many years ago. I was at many years ago. I was at Milarepa Center, and somebody was teaching, and I was studying. It was like a retreat on emptiness, and I realized there came a moment when they said something, and I went back to my room or somewhere, and I was thinking about it, and I had some recognition that, oh, I have a totally wrong consciousness about emptiness. And then I came to a doubt about it. And I was like, and I thought I had understood something about emptiness, but I'd misunderstood it. And then because of what the person had said, I was like, oh, that was totally wrong. Like, what I was thinking was emptiness is totally the opposite of what it should be. And I came to a place of doubt. And I was so grateful. I went and like thanked the person so much. I was like, thank you for, at least I reached a level of doubt. I didn't know it was doubt at the time, but that's what it was. It was like, I just knew I'd been wrong, and so my point is like, I think that, for the most part, we're not, and of course, I mean, until somebody gains a quite advanced experience, one isn't in inferential cognition yet, but one tries to approximate it. And by trying to approximate it in one's meditation, one eventually that's how we get to an inferential cognition. So I think oftentimes you could be in doubt, then you could go back up to the level of correctly assuming consciousness, but it's not through a correct reason. Then sometimes we go back to doubt. And the goal is to eventually come more and more stably to at least a correctly assuming consciousness. And then to come to a correctly assuming consciousness with more and more correct reasons, right? Like, where the reasons are not, like, actually I had, because when I was at Milarepa Center at that time, I had a wrong reason, actually. And that was what I also realized, was like, oh, the reasoning I was applying was totally off from how it should be. And so you eventually come right to what we want to eventually get to, is this fifth one, right? Where we have a correctly assuming consciousness based on the correct reasons, but we're not yet fully fledged, right? Because then you can become fully fledged, right? That's like the last step before becoming fully fledged and then gaining an inferential cognition. But I think, to answer your question, does that make sense? That I think we go back and forth a little bit, but hopefully we're less often, like, a person can eventually reach a point where they're no longer ever going to be in doubt and leaning in the wrong direction. They're always in at least equal doubt. Then eventually they could always be at a point where, they go back and forth between correctly assuming consciousness and doubt leaning in the correct direction, right? So they are like, oh, I really believe this, and then they have some doubt, right? That's a contemplation, right? Then, but it's never leaning in the wrong direction anymore. It's not even equal anymore at a certain point. So you can see how, like, there's a progression, even if you're going back and forth, where you no longer go in the wrong direction. Then you no longer go to equal. Then then eventually you just go back and forth between correctly assuming consciousness and doubt leading in the correct direction, as you're getting closer and closer. And then when you realize the three qualities of a correct reason, then you'll achieve but there comes a point also where you can, like, realize one of them, right? You can realize the like, you could, let's say, for example, if it were the one you gave, right? You could realize the self is not one with the aggregates, and the self is not other than the aggregates. But if a person hasn't, so that would be realizing the property of the subject, right? That it's not, that the self isn't that, and it's the nature, right? The nature of the self is not one with the. But if the person hasn't yet realized that anything that is not one with the aggregates and not is other than the aggregates, therefore doesn't exist, that truly existent self is not, you don't even realize the provision that such a thing couldn't therefore exist. I'm just giving you an example, right? Where you've realized one quality of a reason, but not the other. So you're getting closer and closer to being fully fledged at that point. And that's the goal. That's all I'm pointing out. So I just think that's I think the process, if you look at it from a real lived experience, at least that's what I observed.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. I hope everybody's starting to get more and more sense, though, of how useful these ideas are. Very practice oriented. Like, these are not, because again, I know, like, sometimes these terms can seem a little, I don't know, can seem abstract, but they're very I hope you're getting the sense that they're how we actually relate to these concepts: selflessness or impermanence or all kinds of things in the Lamrim, for example, all different points, right? Like, not every single point in the Lamrim, because some points in the Lamrim we're not yet capable of keeping. valid cognition of, but many of them actually are, this applies to. Sorry, Larry.
Is it correct to say that that going through this process, whether we're doing simple syllogisms that we can get logical answers to, that going through all of this, we're never going to get to and I don't know the correct word to use, but just to say an answer, unless we've reached a point of enlightenment, the ultimate goal that we're going to. So we're going to continue having, and these are my words again, false starts as we go through these processes and doing all these things. And that's part of the process, is to determine what truth is. Maybe I'm making the mistake of doing some comparisons between philosophy and this, but it sounds like there's a lot of similarity in it, and to some extent. And you're looking for truth, but if you're expecting to get it in a short meditation, then you might be disappointed, I think. So it's going to take understanding that this is an ongoing process, and all these processes we're using is just part of that. Is that correct?
Yes, I think on the one, like I'll just sort of share a reflection on that, which is, on the one hand, yes, and there is, none of these are quick, none of them are easy. It's it takes time, it takes a lot of deep thought. It takes, if you read I was a couple of years ago, I read Thupten Jinpa's biography of Tsongkhapa, and he describes this amazing, like decades-long journey to realize emptiness, for example. And that was Tsongkhapa himself, but his studies and his meditations and his retreats, and he had all kinds of debates and contemplations and reading and over again until he eventually realized emptiness. So on the one hand, yes, for sure, it takes years of hard work, and to gain progress is one point in certain areas. But I guess on the other side, though, just a hopeful point, I think, is also that that along the way we can, I guess this is an important point, like, is that you have in these prominent teachings, that you have valid cognitions that are spiritually important along the way, and you don't lose them. In other words, because they're incontrovertible. So in other words, an example would be, when a person realizes, say, gross impermanence, then they've realized gross impermanence, and then they can come back to that, and they know it. They can have a subsequent cognizer of gross impermanence. And that becomes something that helps them throughout the rest of their life. And then and then eventually they can realize subtle impermanence, for example, which is much more difficult to realize and takes much longer, as you said, but is not as subtle as emptiness or selflessness and so on. And then that becomes an incredible, like, I remember once, one of my teachers, Rinpoche Rinpoche, said this. He said, he made a point. He said, until you realize bodhicitta, he said, realizing impermanence is like the main engine of your practice, because you can realize that. He said, that's easy to realize. So he said, if you realize impermanence, you realize it and you know it, and then you don't want to waste your life, and you don't want to waste any time, and that's knowable for ordinary person. And he says, so then that becomes like something you can come back to, like a touchstone that energizes your practice, because it's one thing, and then he said, then eventually you realize bodhicitta. He said, then, it's like so much more powerful, humongously more. But that person hasn't yet necessarily realized emptiness. But okay, good, they have realized bodhicitta. It's amazing, like a spiritual accomplishment, after many years of effort and so on. And then through that, they'll more quickly be energized and have incredibly more energy, because bodhicitta is such a powerful force for accumulating merit and purifying. And then they'll realize other things, and so on. So it's like that there's also, so on the one hand, you're 100% right, that all of these things take effort and deep thought and contemplation. And I think at the same time, I think a hopeful point is that that we can like realize a given point, and sort of, if it's incontrovertible, then that becomes like something we can come back to, that sort of like a rung almost on our a ladder or a step on the way, then you don't have to go below again. You can go back to it if you're starting to forget it, but that, and so you can kind of come back to that awareness as a subsequent cognizer. That's the value of subsequent cognizers on a spiritual level, is once you really realize something, you can come back to it, and it becomes like a subsequent cognizer that you can use to decrease your mental afflictions, to help you continue on the path. and then of course, and there are so many levels, because like even after somebody realized emptiness directly, the first bhumi, they realize the path of seeing. At that point, it's amazing a spiritual outcome. Right? A bodhisattva, let's say, who achieves the path of seeing, has a direct, non-conceptual realization of emptiness. But they still have 9 more bhumis to go before they're a Buddha, so they're far from a Buddha yet. So my point being, like even that, they'll come back to a subsequent cognition of their recognition of their direct realization of emptiness, and they'll use that to overcome subtler and subtler obstacles in their being, that are still obstacles to being a Buddha, and so on. So on each level we gain in terms of any understanding helps us to gain the next one. I guess my point. It's an amazing process, isn't it? Yeah. Any other comments or questions? It's great that people are thinking about the material. I think it's this very thought-provoking material. So we have a few minutes. Maybe I'll just do one more, because I think it's fairly. I'll just start on awareness to which an object appears, but is without being ascertained. So it's 10 minutes. Yeah, we can probably do that. So with respect to the third of the 5 types of non-pramana, non-valid consciousnesses, awareness to which an object appears, but without being ascertained, the definition of something's being an awareness to which an object appears without being ascertained is a knower that is a common locus of having a clear appearance of the specifically characterized phenomena that is its object of operation, and being unable to induce ascertainment with respect to the specifically characterized phenomena that is its object of operation. So at least we can introduce this one. This one is straightforward, I think. The common example of this, an object to which so one is specifically characterized phenomena, just to it uses that term. Remember, for those of you who took tenets, in this tenet system, right? So in the tenet system of the Sautantrikas, a specifically characterized phenomena is an impermanent functioning thing, right? So it's a, and actually, according to this school, those things are truly existent and are even they're not ultimate truths, but they are ultimately existent, according to this school, which is different than the Prasangika, of course. But anyway, to put it simply, so it's just talking about functioning things, right? So what it's saying is that a conscious to which an object appears but is not ascertained is, how does it say here? It has a clear appearance of that functioning thing or impermanent thing, but it doesn't induce ascertainment. And so that would be, I mean, this is quite straightforward. It's like, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, there are countless examples, but so a typical example would be if you're really engrossed in a conversation with your friend, right? And you hear a car pass by, but you don't notice it, right? Like, so your ear consciousness, it does appear to your ear consciousness, but you don't register it, right? And part of the way you get at that is so you can't remember it. So you can so you didn't ascertain it and you can't remember it. And that happens often, doesn't it? Where you'll say, like, does that happen to you often? It happens to me more often though. Like, where sometimes like somebody will like, it's oftentimes where Shayla will say that, don't you remember? You were there, and I'll say, oh, did that happen? Like, because I was paying attention to something else, right? If you're paying attention to something different, and then you go, and so you say, did that happen? I guess it probably happened. I didn't really register it, I guess, like that. That's this. Does that make sense? Where there, and it's not that it didn't, it's not that so your sensory consciousness, it's a sensory consciousness does register something, or it does perceive something, but you could say it doesn't really ascertain it, and therefore you can't remember it, and you don't, and usually, I mean, there are many examples of that where it's like, and it says here below, an example, an illustration would be a sense direct perceiver apprehending blue that induces doubt, wondering, did I see blue or not? Right. And so it'd be like, that's often happens, right? Like where you're, if you're really engrossed in a conversation with somebody, or if you were listening to music and you were so engrossed in the music, and then you say, oh, and somebody says, did you see, you were at a concert listening to music and you were really, and then somebody says, was the person next to you wearing a blue shirt? You say, did I see, were they or not? I don't know, but the music was great, like that. So in other words, your eyes, if you look that way, of course your eyes would see the blue, but you didn't ascertain it, if you could say. And then it's good. So it says, however, one should know the manner in which not to posit the definition of something's being an awareness to which an object appears not ascertained, become those having a clear appearance of a specifically characterized phenomena that is its object, and being unable to induce ascertainment with respect to the specifically characterized that is object. This is because the sense consciousness sees the snow not as blue. Enumeration does not see clearly. So what this is saying is, so what this is saying actually is, should I go back? So it's saying the specifically characterized phenomena that is its object of operation. Another way of saying object of operation is, should I go back here? Oh, object of engagement is another term in the text from the very first class. So what this is saying is, it's not, what's the object of engagement or object of operation? And what it's saying here is that so the object that it's engaging with, and it gives the example of a snow mountain, right? So the object and snow, snow mountains are white in color, and so on, because snow is white. And so what it's saying here is the object of operation or the object of engagement, in this, it gives an example of a white snow mountain. And what it's saying is still, since its appearing object, the white color of the snow mountain, appears clearly as blue, whereas it does not exist as blue, there is a clear appearance to it of a specifically characterized phenomenon, which is so what this is saying is what this is getting at really is that the object perceived and the object of engagement can sometimes the object perceived is different than the object we could misperceive, right? The object of engagement or the object of operation. And so I guess the key point here, I think, if I understood it correctly at least, is that in either case it can be an object that appears but is not ascertained. So in other words, whether you're perceiving it accurately or not isn't the issue, right? It's that you didn't ascertain it. So in other words, that you perceive a specifically characterized phenomena, but you don't ascertain it. Is the key point. And then it gives 3 examples, and we'll just conclude with this. So the 3 examples are, one is, the most common one is this, is a sense direct perceiver apprehending something that doesn't, where it doesn't register, as I'm putting it, right? So it's not ascertained. And that could be any of the senses, right? So another same thing, I give you an example if you didn't see something, but it could be you don't hear something. Like if you're totally engrossed in looking at a work of art, let's say, or something, and somebody talks to you and you don't hear what they said, right? And then later they say, I told you that. You say, did you? Right? Oh, I don't remember, right? You didn't ascertain their words, so it could be any sense. Then another example they give is a mental direct perceiver in the continuum of an ordinary being apprehending the 5 objects. What that's getting at is this, it's just that after you have a sensory direct, according to Buddhism, according to this tenet system of Buddhism, after you have a sensory direct perception of something, there's a very brief moment. They say it's like 1/64th or 65th of a finger snap or something, where there's a mental direct perception of that object. And then you oftentimes develop a conceptual idea about that object. And what they're saying is ordinary people don't ever note it. We're not introspective. We're not, our minds aren't aware enough to be aware of that brief moment of mental direct perception. And it says ordinary people because Aryas are able to be aware of that. Actually, it said in one commentary, Arya beings have a longer period of mental direct perception and are able to notice it and be aware of it. But ordinary people, we don't notice that brief moment. So it's that brief moment of mental direct perception of things is an object for ordinary people that is occurs but is not ascertained. So that would be another example. Aryas do ascertain it, we don't, we ordinary people don't. And the last is self-knowers experiencing those mental direct perceivers. Because again, we're not aware of that self-knower, it's too brief. But anyway, the key point, I think, I mean, there are a lot of details here, but I think the key point about objects to which an object appears but is not ascertained, you get the main point. The main point is it's something that appears to a mental or a sense consciousness, but you don't register it, you don't ascertain it, and therefore you can't remember it. And I think, you know, all ordinary people sometimes have that experience. And so, and what they're getting at is that is a knower in the sense that, you know, if your eye conscious saw blue, but you didn't register it, you did still see blue. You just didn't register the blue. Or, you know, the sound, like, do you ever, I've had that experience, like where you know, you hear something, but you can't, like, you're like, oh yeah, that person said something, what was it? You know, or something like that. So your conscious did hear the words, but you didn't register it, you didn't make it out. Because you were focused on something else is usually the issue. But anyway, so we'll conclude there. And I just want to suggest this idea, though, to really take these ideas, if you're willing, and try to apply them to your own experience of, you know, again, I'm going to suggest two ideas, just two things to play with, I guess. One is with regards to these spiritually significant topics like selflessness or emptiness, to ask yourself, well, where am I at? How do I know that? Am I doubt? Am I mostly in doubt? Am I mostly correctly assuming consciousness? Do I just have a wrong consciousness? But then also to try it, to understand the concepts better, I want to suggest, try a mundane example. You know, and in Buddhism, they often give these examples, right? Sound is impermanent and so on. That's good. They're useful to understand the concept, but pick something that's like your own everyday experience, if that makes sense. Like, you know, it could be like, I really think this person's terrible, my coworker or something, right? Well, how do I know that? You know, are they, there is like, does everyone perceive them as terrible? And then ask, is that a wrong consciousness? Do I have any doubts? You know, whatever. I'm giving different examples here. Or it could be a social view or a personal view or something you feel about your family or something you feel about, you know, social issues or political issues or whatever. It doesn't matter what. But the idea here is look for your own experience, right, of doubt or of wrong consciousness. And just then you'll understand the concepts, but and then ask yourself, well, how would I move beyond wherever I'm at? If I have a wrong consciousness, how would I move out of that wrong consciousness? Or a part of me is a wrong consciousness, holds door. How would I work with that? And debate with yourself a little bit. I just think it's fun to do that and spiritually useful to do. We should stop there and do our dedication. Supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled totally empty from their own side, so that the I, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, and lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled totally empty from their own side to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Well, thanks everybody, and you know, we'll pick up there. Oh, in the chat, but we'll pick up there, I guess, next time. Which I guess is, it's not. I think it's not next week. I know that because it's Long Life Puja for Contemplative next week, but I think it's in maybe it's in 3 weeks. I guess. Yeah, next class I guess is in 3 weeks. So on the 16th, it looks like. Is that right? Yeah, the 16th and the 30th, I guess, of April class. So because we're trying to do twice a month, so it's on the website. But I just wanted to confirm that. So okay, hope everybody has a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.